I want to talk this morning on the 7 great cardinal freedoms of Jesus. I don't know how far I'll get in the 7, but perhaps I'll get somewhere. The first cardinal freedom that I want to mention this morning is forgiveness. Forgive, and ye shall be forgiven. We can be released, we can be emancipated, we can be saved. For these great promises have been communicated to us by sacrificial love from the cross. And this salvation by sacrificial love manifests itself in and through us as redemptive love. And this we can receive by means of being forgiven. There are 2 of these promises of forgiveness which are very important. And one is, be of good cheer. Thy sins be forgiven thee. And this means to be good cheerfully, which is quite a chore. It's very easy to be good in a solemn, funeral-like way and take on the character and physiognomy. I didn't know I had that word in my book. That came by a brand new revelation. The physiognomy of an old-fashioned undertaker. We can be good that way, but Jesus said, be good cheerfully. Let's practice that. Then he says, forgive, and ye shall be forgiven. I want to bring forth one of my very best testimonies in regard to forgiveness. That happened in the school for Christian workers some years ago. For about 30 years, I've been collecting testimonies in regard to the light and the superphysical illuminations. I think Dr. Laubach has given the world the greatest collection on earth. I don't think anyone has ever equaled him in collecting these original illuminative experiences. And William James, in his Varieties of Religious Experience, drew upon Dr. Laubach's collection in a very great extent and produced that immortal work, the Varieties of Religious Experience. My collection has not been so much on illumination as it has been on salvation, and scattered through that collection are some on sanctification. I believe I have a large collection through the years, and scores of these have been put into my books. For I am persuaded that testimony and witness is a powerful thing that the Lord can use to work in and through, to help other people. And this one that I'm mentioning this morning on forgiveness is one such as this that has helped many, many people. in this school for Christian workers, they had a professor there who was debunking the miracles of Jesus. And so the professor of Bible history, New Testament history, had me come down there while he was doing this debunking, and they put me up in the bishop's chamber. And it was a marvelous chamber, great big one, high ceiling, 2 or 3 rooms, and I rattled around in there in meditation and had a good time. They didn't give me a platform there, but allowed me to walk around and capture whomever I could and get off in a parlor somewhere and talk. Well, I talked on redemptive love all the time. And I was debunking the debunker. Sometimes it'd get quite a little knot of students around in the parlor. We'd talk and discuss and pray. Finally, just before I was getting ready to leave, one of the students, a girl, came up and she said, "I have heard you talk so much about love that it's made me sick." Well, some strange allergies. I talked about it in a Chicago retreat once, and a young woman came up and told me about her boss. He was a terrible fellow, and she didn't know whether to quit or stay. She described him as Scrooge in the carols of Dickens. Must have been awful. And she said, "What should I do?" Why, I said, "You've got to love the man." But she said, "He's utterly unlovable." I said, "Love him anyway." "Do you love everybody?" Well, she said she'd try. And about 2 weeks later, I heard a report from her. Said, "I tried that love theory of yours, and it worked, but my boss misunderstood it." She said, "He's been changed, all right. Nearly every morning he comes by my desk and gives me a new poem that he wrote that night." And she said, "The fact is, I'm getting to like him. And it looks like some romance is ahead." And actually, they eventually got married. She loved him into loving. Well, this girl had an allergy to my love theory. And then she told me a very pathetic story. She was brought up with a boy in the neighborhood. They'd gone to school together, had visited in each other's homes. And it reminded me of a case up in Springfield, Massachusetts, where a girl was babysitting, and they had been neighbors and friends, had gone to school together. And one night she was babysitting, and the boy went over to sit with her. And during the night, while they were there together, he went out in the kitchen and got a knife and stabbed her to death. The parents were fine Christian people, pillars of their church, very popular in Springfield. And of course he was in jail on a charge of murder, and they fought it out for a long time as to whether or not to execute him or to give him life in prison. And finally, a psychiatrist came from New York and examined him, and on the basis of his testimony and his diagnosis, he finally was sent to prison for life. I talked with him in the county jail in Springfield, and twice since that time I've visited with him in the penitentiary. This happened to this girl. It is a compulsion or an obsession. Something seizes upon a person, and they do these things without knowing what they're doing. And this boy went into the kitchen, and her mother, got out the cake box, cut a piece of cake, and he grabbed the knife out of her hand and killed her. An irresistible compulsion. I say irresistible, for there's nothing can resist it except God. And she said, "What would you do if this had happened to you?" But I said, "My dear, this did not happen to me. I don't know what I would do. This happened to you. I know what I would have to do, whether I could do it or not. I would have to forgive that offender and love him." Well, she said, "I can't forgive him, and I won't forgive him. I don't want to forgive him. And as long as he's in prison and I'm here, I'm going to do everything in my power to keep him right there, even if it's to the end of his days." And I asked her what she was doing in that school for Christian workers, and she told me she was getting ready for some missionary work and social service. And I suggested that she pack up her bags and get out just as quick as she could. For if you operate in this school for Christian workers on a basis of hatred and unforgiveness, I can guarantee that you will be burned up in friction fire. If you want to carry on this hate and this unforgiving spirit, you want to harbor that, I believe you ought to get outside of the orbit of Christianity altogether. And you will be less hurt if you do. But if you keep trying to be Christian and to render Christian service with this in your heart, you will be burned up by friction fire. Well, she began to cry, and she ran off to her room. She cried all night. And the next morning, I saw her again alone, and she hadn't slept, and she was under great conviction and didn't know what to do about it. Evidently, my suggestions had sunk in very deeply. And she told me that she'd like to be made ready to forgive, but it seemed impossible. I said, "It is. You can't do it. Only God can do that. He gave you this conviction, and because He gave you this conviction, He is also ready and willing to give you the power to overcome." I told her I would be willing to go into the chapel and tarry with her until she forgave. And then I was sorry I said it, because the chapel floor was made of flagstones. And my knees were already pretty creaky. But after I had said it, I had to go through with it because she wanted to go through with it, and we went in. And by the time she got through to forgiveness, and she received it from the forgiver of all sin, And she received it from love, redemptive love. Being fervent in your love among yourselves, for love covereth a multitude of sins. And when she received it, she was in great joy. The tears were still there, but they had been transformed from tears of conviction and sorrow and chaos into tears of great joy and bliss. And she just knelt there before the altar praising God. She had forgiven the boy. And she told me afterwards, a little while afterwards now, she said, I know why I'm here. I didn't know before. My social service work and my ministry will be among those who are incarcerated in penal institutions and reformatories and correctional institutions, and in the field of preventing young people from entering into crime. Wonderful experience. When that forgiveness came, when she forgave, she was forgiven and was set free, was emancipated, released, and saved. And it was all communicated to her through sacrificial love from that cross. She went to the state prison the next day with me to give a talk there. I told her just to sit back and just beam love on all those prisoners. She sat back there in great smiles and joy and just poured out love. And the chaplain permitted the ranks to break that day and allowed an altar call. And we knelt down and they came by in line. And how she blessed them. Oh, I don't know how many. I don't know whether there were conversions or not. But there must have been 200 came by in that line. And she just put her hands on their head and smiled and blessed them. And they went on out and back to their seats. This wonderful freedom to forgive and be forgiven is one of the cardinal freedoms of Jesus. Forgive and you shall be forgiven. And another one of these great freedoms is help in the time of need. Behold, I will help thee. And I know how good this one is. I've seen this demonstrated recently in my life, or during this year and most of last year. I have experienced tremendous need, and I've had to have help. And the help usually comes not directly but through persons. I think it was last winter that I became exhausted and went up into that Mojave Desert to our home, and there was an epidemic of Asian flu up there. And in this exhaustive state, I caught it. I was all alone in the house, and I was really awfully sick. I had no ambition to do anything. I couldn't even go out and scratch up something to eat, and my body was wasting away and undernourished. I wasn't eating. And I was there in that house and unable hardly to do anything or try to do anything or even pray. I was too sick even to pray. And the telephone rang one morning, and the call was from Oklahoma City. And George Hales was on the line, and he seemed to have sensed that something was wrong up there with me. And I told him how sick I was, and he got Tommy. And they got in George's plane, and they flew up there to 29 Palms in the desert and landed on our little airstrip out to the edge of town. And they came in and ministered unto me with love. George went down and got a great big bag full of food. And he came back and he put on an apron. And Tommy picked up a broom and went to dragging those sand-filled and dust-filled dirty throw rugs out on the patio. And he began to sweep. George began to cook. And to me, this is one of the great symbols of redemptive, homely love. I don't even know whether they said to me, "Let us pray," or not. But I have an idea that they did an awful lot of praying while they were working around in the kitchen and sweeping out the sand and dirt. That's the way, to me, that love manifests itself right down here among men. I know that you can get off on cloud 9 about it. You can rise up from the earth in this love and let your legs just dangle and not touch the earth. But when you come right down to it, it becomes a homely affair. And they stayed 2 days. And with all this nourishment and all this prayer that I got, I came out of that in a very remarkable way and was able to drive them back out to that airstrip. I saw them get in the plane and taxi down to the end, turn around and give her the gun, and I could wave them goodbye. That's what love does. Gets right down to where the need is. And I will help thee. I will help thee is a promise. It is a cardinal promise. It is one of the things that sets us free. Another one of these great freedoms of Jesus is simply this: guidance, direction, leading. The Lord will guide thee continually, says the Bible. And I know that he will, if we are willing to get out of the way and let him do it. His guidance is absolutely certain, if we can only get still enough and listen and let it come through. The still small voice speaks to us from within. If we will enter into our closet and close the door and shut out the clamor of the 5 physical senses, separate ourselves momentarily from the world, and really get still, and then just whisper to our Heavenly Father, who is in secret and who hears us in secret and who then rewards us openly. Not easy to get still unless we are willing to work at it. I think it is true that the patron saint of America is St. Vitus. We're a very busy folk. All action, no quiet. Even our prayers are like St. Vitus' prayers sometimes. We talk so loud and long to God that he can't possibly hear anything. And yet, he talks to us as a still small voice. In the Old Testament said that God wasn't in the cyclone. He wasn't in the fire, and he wasn't in the earthquake. As one translation puts it, he was in the voice of gentle stillness. And I've got to the place where I'm a little bit afraid to advocate stillness. For most people are destroyed by stillness. If you're alone and lonely in your aloneness, then you can be destroyed. But if you're alone and your aloneness is filled with God, then you're bound to be restored. One of the most dangerous things that I know in the spiritual life, in the quest, is to be still while entertaining and harboring negative attitudes and feelings. All the psychiatrists that I know, with whom I have talked, tell me that the one thing they seek in their patients is that deeply hidden sense of guilt. These patients have not received forgiveness. For one reason or another, they have considered themselves unworthy of being forgiven. Yet, no matter how unworthy one is, forgiveness is available. That sense of guilt, entertained in the silence, will eat upon the nervous system and the brain, and those very invisible, delicate spiritual centers that we have in our being, until we are cut off from God. If you're going to practice silence, don't let any negative influences get into it. For these negative influences just love to work on you in the silence. And oddly enough, most of these negative influences are harbored in silence. A married couple can be together and be entertaining a grudge against each other, and they may never mention it, but they just live day and night entertaining and coddling that grudge in secrecy and silence, and it just feeds on both of them until eventually it destroys them. And save for some religious reason or some other reason, they stay together instead of winding it up in the divorce court. Nearly all these terribly destructive influences are held in silence. They operate in silence, and they feed on us in silence. And yet these are the very things that need to be forgiven. All we have to do is to go to the forgiver, the Redeemer, and he will forgive them, release them, emancipate them, and let them go. If we go to the psychiatrist, we can have a comfortable time lying on his couch, that's true. No question about that. And he's willing for us to do it. I think the average cost now is $20 an hour. And it takes about 2 years to get anywhere. So it becomes quite expensive in the long run. And in case it's a guilt, the chances are very great that we'll not let him get to that. Because it is true that we can get married to our sense of guilt and be so in union with it and tied in with it that when the psychiatrist gets close to it, we'll protect it. And all he wants to do is for us to confess it. And if we'll confess it to him, he will throw it out. Well, we can go directly to the Lord and confess it to him. I'm not much on confessing to human beings, or if I made a confession to a human being, I'm afraid I'd shock him to death. And then, if I shocked him enough, he would be apt to sit in judgment upon me. So I don't want to tempt anybody with my confessions. Why go to a human being when you can go directly to the Lord? And there isn't any way under the sun for us to shock him. He's seen all, heard all, and there isn't anything that he doesn't know. So you can just talk to him and tell him anything. And all he will say, God bless you. That's wonderful. Never sit in judgment. He just pours on love as you pour out negation and sets you free. Then he promises peace of heart, and this is wonderful. As I said, for about a year or more, I was unable to have peace of heart. I went through a terrible series of strange and unusual, puzzling things in the past 2 years. This decade, in fact, has been pretty hard on me. I've had some of the most curious accidents. I was driving through a lonely road, a hypnotic road in the desert, and I think I dozed off, and the front wheels of the car hit a soft shoulder, and the car turned over 4 times, gouging great big holes in the desert. And it came down on the wheels with the rubber nearly all gone, and I was still sitting behind the wheel. And I even tried to start the car. Of course, there wasn't anything there to start. The whole thing was a shambles. The top was caved in, and the back seat had gone through the top. The heater and the dashboard and everything was wrecked. The doors were caved in, and I had one of those windshields in it that pop out when you get into trouble. And this windshield was lying way off in the desert. And I got out and shook myself. My ears were full of sand, my nose and hair and my pockets full of sand. And I got out on the highway, and finally someone came, and I asked him if he would notify somebody when he got into town. He notified the parole sheriff, sheriff patrol. I went back and sat down in the car, what was left of it, and finally he came over and asked me if I was hurt, and I said, yes, I've scratched my elbow. He said, do you realize that this car has turned over 4 times and dug great big holes in the desert? I said, no, I didn't realize that. I didn't know it was that bad. And he said, you're not hurt? I said, no, feel pretty good. And he stood there in silence and looked in and smelled my breath. Then he went out and radioed somewhere. By and by, one of these tow things came, and they hooked on to that wreck and dragged it out on the road and practically dragged the thing into town. I guess it's still in town. I've had some of the strangest things. I've had some citations that I wasn't supposed to have. 2 of them were even over in Arizona. Then I was behind a truck down in Arcadia, California, downtown, and the truck stopped suddenly, and I stopped, and the car swerved in and smashed into another parked car. And I wondered if anything more could happen. It's been, this decade has just been terrible. Well, if I didn't lose my faith through all that, I can only thank God. But through all this, there has been indwelling, down beneath the surface, a sense of blessed assurance and a sense of peace of heart. I had been preaching for years in a state of complacency that the next thing to happen to you is the best thing, providing you love the Lord. And I brought this upon myself. He said, all right, you've been preaching this. Let's see how you can take it. Well, it wasn't easy. But we're here to be overcomers. And we're here to be overcomers in Him. And I don't suppose He does these things to us, but He gives us rope and turns us loose and lets us bring them upon ourselves if we want. And then, if this thing that has happened to us is turned over to Him, He makes us overcomers. And even in the midst of our despair and our pain and sorrow, He gives us that sense of blessed assurance in the heart, even when everything is chaotic on the outside. There is at the center of our being a state of perfect, undisturbed peace. And this peace cannot be touched by anything in the external world. And everything that's in heaven has its counterpart on earth. For what is above, there is also the same below. As below, so above. And as there is peace in our heart, at the center of our being, there is also peace in the midst of a tornado or a cyclone. The Weather Bureau send their aviators crashing through the chaos and conflict of these terrible tornadoes, and they send those planes through all that turmoil, and eventually they come out at the center of that tornado, and this is called the eye of the tornado. And in that eye they find a perfect state of peace and serenity and tranquility. Not a bit of disturbance there at all. A perfect rhythm of silence. And that's the way it is with us. The outer personality is in confusion, conflict and chaos and frustration, and it's just churning and churning emotionally like a tornado. While all the time on the inside, in the heart, is that peace that passes all understanding. My peace I give unto you, not as the world giveth, give I and it's always there. And if we could imitate the aviator and fly through that with our commitment and our surrender, fly through all this external emotional chaos that's boiling up, we could come right into the heart and find a perfect state of blessed assurance and peace. A wonderful thing, and it's all there. As the old man in the TB ward who was dying, and I was on duty one night, probably one of the most wicked men I had ever known. And there was a boy, he used to make fun of everybody who would send for the chaplain when they were dying. And he let everybody know that he was making fun of them and making fun of the chaplain. And this boy, he was about 19, and it came his time to go. I always knew when one would go. They always went in the night. And about 5 hours before one was scheduled to leave this plane, all the others in great excitement would gather around one bed, and they would just chatter like magpies, and you couldn't get them back to bed. They'd stay right there and talk, 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 talk. They knew one of their number was going. And I would know it because of this. And this boy was going, and he asked for the chaplain to come and pray. And the chaplain was not available. And when this was made known that the chaplain was not available, this old fellow, this wicked old man, began to mock and to say all kinds of things about the chaplain. No, he won't come in here. He talks about heaven, but he's not eager to go. And he's not eager to come in here and catch our germs. Such stuff as that. Well, this boy was going and he couldn't get the chaplain, and so I sat down on the edge of his bed, and he asked me if I would pray. At that time, I didn't know very much about formal praying. I knew a little about it, but not much. My system of communication at that time was essentially contemplation and meditation. I told him that I didn't know much about praying, but I said I will do the best I can. I can at least talk to God for you and about you. So I lifted him up. By now he was just a skeleton, and everything about him was depressive except his eyes. His eyes, TB patients have wonderful eyes. Their eyes just get full of light and fever and fervor. And I picked him up and held him in my arms. I had on a white shirt and duck pants. And I talked as best I could to God about him, to help his spirit get over and not be earthbound. And while I was talking that way, he hemorrhaged his last, and it came down over my white shirt and clear down over my duck pants, and he passed on, his spirit. I just felt his spirit go right like that. And I went over and stood by the bed of this wicked patient. And I just stood there and let him look at that blood. There seemed to be a change come over him after that. I don't know what caused it, but he was watching every detail of this thing that was going on right across the room from him. And then it came his night to go, and he was trying to say something, and I got down close to his ear and asked him what it was. And he lifted a very weak hand like that and pointed to the wall, and I looked at his eyes, and he was looking through the wall. His eyes was penetrating into something very far away and remote. He wasn't seeing the wall. And I said, "What is it? What is it? What do you see?" And he said, "Don't be a fool." He said, "It's all there, just as plain as day." Now here was a very wicked man. But somehow or other, in that experience of that boy, and his watching over there, watching every detail, and seeing that final hemorrhage, and the boy slumping against me and his spirit going off, I believe something happened to that man on the inside. And when it came his time to go, just before he went, he saw the other world. And I said, "What is it again?" And he said, "Don't be a fool. It's beautiful." I think nearly everyone making that final journey sees into the heavenly world. I don't know what happens after they see this vision. They may have to come back and do some repenting and all that. But I think the first thing that a person sees, unless the death is sudden, like in an accident, I think if it's natural, I think the first thing we see is into the heavenly world. And I think we would all declare with this old man that it really is beautiful. We thank God for every opportunity